For 3 hours, the crew had been tracking a signature that refused to follow the standard flight corridors of the Iranian Air Force. Whether the contact was a ghost in the machine or a predator in the clouds was a question the crew was about to answer with their lives. The air at 25,000 feet was thin and freezing, a stark contrast to the humid, salt-heavy haze hanging over the Strait of Hormuz. Below them, the sea was a flat sheet of obsidian, broken only by the dim, flickering lights of a distant oil tanker. Inside the converted Boeing 737 airframe, the atmosphere was a mix of sterile professionalism and rising static. The cabin was bathed in the soft blue glow of 12 high-definition workstations. Commander Sarah Jenkins sat in the left seat of the cockpit, her eyes scanning the primary flight display. Beside her, the co-pilot was adjusting the throttle settings to maintain a steady patrol speed of 250 knots. The hum of the twin jet engines was a constant, vibrating backdrop. To the clicks of headsets and the low murmurs of the mission crew in the back, they were there to watch. They were the eyes and ears of the United States Navy, monitoring the flow of traffic through the most contested choke point on the planet. But tonight, the eyes were seeing something they did not like. Tactical flight, Jenkins said into her headset. That contact at our 6 o'clock. Give me an update. Flight. Tactical, came the reply from the back of the aircraft. The contact is closing. Range is now 65 miles. Altitude is 30,000 feet. He is coming in fast, Commander. Speed is currently Mach 1.2. Jenkins felt a tighten in her chest. A civilian aircraft did not fly at Mach 1.2. A routine patrol did not intercept from the rear at supersonic speeds. Any electronic identification? Jenkins asked. Negative, the tactical officer replied. He is running silent. No transponder. No search radar. He is using passive sensors to find us. The P-8 Poseidon was a sophisticated machine packed with the most advanced maritime surveillance technology in the world. But it was not a dogfighter. It was a large, sluggish target, compared to the sleek steel of a dedicated interceptor. 40 miles behind them, hidden by the curve of the earth and the shroud of night, an Iranian F-14 Tomcat sliced through the cold air. The jet was a relic of a different era, a heavy, twin-engine beast with variable sweep wings. Yet it remained one of the most lethal platforms in the region. Underneath its fuselage sat the long, white shapes of 4 AIM-54 Phoenix missiles. Each one was a half-ton of high explosives and sophisticated guidance logic, designed specifically to kill large aircraft from incredible distances. The Iranian pilot, a veteran of 100 coastal patrols, kept his hands steady on the stick. He was not using his own radar yet. He did not want to scream his presence to the American sensors. Instead, he was slave to a ground-based tracking station that was feeding him the precise coordinates of the Poseidon. To the American crew, he was a growing blur on the edge of their awareness. To him, they were a massive, slow-moving heat signature on his infrared display. Range 50 miles, the tactical officer called out, his voice an octave higher than it had been a minute ago. He is accelerating. Mach 1.4. He is definitely coming for us. This is United States Navy aircraft on international frequency. The co-pilot broadcasted, his voice firm but urgent. To the aircraft at our 6 o'clock, you are approaching a United States sovereign platform in international airspace. Identify yourself and change your heading immediately. Silence followed. The only sound in the headsets was the faint crackle of atmospheric interference. Repeat, the co-pilot said. Identify yourself or we will be forced to take defensive measures. Jenkins looked at the digital map. They were well outside Iranian territorial waters, but in this part of the world, lines on a map were often treated as suggestions. She could feel the vibration of the airframe, a subtle shudder, as the Poseidon's flight computers tried to compensate for the wake turbulence of the high-altitude winds. The smell of recycled air and electronic ozone filled her nostrils. He's not turning, Jenkins whispered. Range 40 miles, the back-end operator reported. Commander, we just picked up a momentary sweep. High frequency. X-band. That was an AWG-9 radar pulse. He just looked at us. The game of hide-and-seek was over. The Iranian Tomcat had just turned on its eyes. The Poseidon was no longer just a contact on a screen. It was a target. All hands, battle stations, Jenkins commanded. Deploy the first set of decoys. I want a hard turn to the west. Get us closer to the carrier strike group. The heavy aircraft groaned as Jenkins pulled it into a steep bank. The move was sluggish, like a whale trying to outrun a shark. In the distance, the first hint of the Iranian jet's exhaust plume flickered like a malevolent star against the black horizon. 5:15 in the morning. The sky over the Persian Gulf was a bruised, dark purple. The P-8 Poseidon groaned as it pushed through a hard bank to the west. The airframe, designed for stability and endurance rather than agility, shuddered under the stress of the maneuver. Inside the cockpit, the flight controls vibrated against Commander Jenkins' palms. The smell of hot electronics and recycled oxygen was sharp in the cramped space. Range is 30 miles, the tactical officer shouted from the back. He is ignoring the warning. He is not breaking off. The Iranian Tomcat is staying right on our tail. On the tactical display, the two icons were converging. The American surveillance plane was a slow-moving dot. The Iranian interceptor was a jagged arrow, slicing through the air at over 1,000 miles per hour. The distance was closing with terrifying speed. Every 10 seconds, the two aircraft were 3 miles closer to a collision or a combat engagement. 40,000 feet above the water, Captain Abbas Rezai adjusted, the oxygen mask on his face. He felt the heavy pull of G-forces as he tilted his F-14 Tomcat into a shallow dive. The cockpit of the vintage fighter was a tight fit, filled with the hum of old-fashioned cooling fans and the rhythmic clicking of the radar altimeter. Through the canopy, the stars were beginning to fade as the sun prepared to break the horizon. Rezai did not look at the stars. His eyes were locked on the green glow of the heads-up display. The American aircraft was a large, heat-blooming box in the center of his glass. He could see the faint trail of its engine exhaust against the cold upper atmosphere. Target is locked, his radar intercept officer said over the internal comms. The Phoenix missile is energized. We have a solid track. One press of the button, and it is over. Wait, Rezai replied. His voice was muffled by the mask. Let them sweat. Let them see how close they are to the edge. Inside the Poseidon, the cockpit was a symphony of alarms. A steady, high-pitched chirping indicated that a fire control radar was painting the aircraft. It was the electronic equivalent of a sniper's laser dot resting on a forehead. "We are being tracked," the co-pilot yelled. "He has a hard lock. Commander, we need to deploy the towed decoy now." "Do it," Jenkins commanded. "Dump the first set of flares and chaff. Brake left, hard left." The P-8 dropped a cluster of magnesium flares that burned with the intensity of 1,000 suns. They tumbled into the dark air, creating a wall of heat intended to blind any incoming infrared missiles. A cloud of aluminum foil strips, known as chaff, erupted from the belly of the plane to create a false radar return. From his cockpit, Rezai watched the fireworks. The flares looked like falling stars against the Black Sea. He smiled behind his mask. He wasn't using a heat-seeking missile yet. He was using the Phoenix, a weapon that used its own internal radar to find its prey. The flares were useless against the heavy steel bird he carried under his fuselage. "The Americans are panicking," the radar officer said. "They are dumping everything they have. Range is 25 miles. We are well within the kill zone." The Iranian fighter swept its wings back into a sharp delta shape. The roar of its twin engines increased as Rezai pushed the throttles into full afterburner. Two massive pillars of orange flame erupted from the exhaust nozzles, pushing the jet to Mach 1.6. The vibration in the cockpit became a violent shaking, a physical manifestation of the raw power of the aircraft. "This is United States Navy aircraft on international guard frequency," the co-pilot's voice screamed through Rezai's headset. "You are engaging in a hostile act. Turn away or we will defend ourselves." Rezai switched his radio to the same frequency. He did not identify himself. He did not offer a reason. "You are in the wrong place at the wrong time," he said in English. He flipped the master arm switch to the on position. A red light illuminated on his instrument panel. The AIM-54 Phoenix missile was now live. It was no longer a piece of hardware. It was a hungry predator waiting for the cage to open. Range 20 miles, the radar officer reported. The target is trying to dive. They are heading for the deck. They can't hide, Rezai said. There is nowhere to go. The cold air outside the Tomcat screamed as it was torn apart by the supersonic shape. The ocean below was a blur of dark gray. The P-8 Poseidon was now visible to the naked eye, a white shape against the gloom, desperately trying to find safety in the lower, thicker air. It was a race between a bird of prey and a cargo hauler, and the outcome had been decided 30 years ago in a design bureau. "Commander, he's still coming!" the tactical officer cried out. "He's at Mach 1.6! He's going to fire! He's going to fire!" Jenkins gripped the control yoke so hard her knuckles turned white. The deck beneath her feet was vibrating with the strain of the descent. The smell of sweat was thick in the cockpit. She looked out the side window and saw the faint, terrifying glow of the Iranian afterburners. "Brace for impact," Jenkins whispered. "God help us." 5:21 in the morning. The P-8 Poseidon dove toward the churning waves. Commander Jenkins pushed the nose down hard, seeking the thick, salt-heavy air near the surface. She wanted to use the sea clutter to hide from the Iranian radar. The airframe groaned under the negative G-forces. Loose flight manuals slid across the cockpit floor. The smell of hot metal and ozone from the straining electronics filled the small space. "Electronic warfare officer, go to maximum power," Jenkins shouted. "Jam everything." In the back of the plane, the electronic warfare officer worked with frantic precision. His fingers danced across a glass touchscreen. He activated the ANALQ-213 countermeasure suite. A massive burst of digital noise erupted from the Poseidon's antennas. It was an invisible wall of electromagnetic energy. The goal was to drown the Iranian radar in a sea of white static. "Broadband jamming is active," the officer reported. "I am flooding the X-band. We are ghosting his display." Inside the F-14 Tomcat, the world turned to digital chaos. Captain Rezai's radar screen washed out in a blur of flickering green lines. The steady lock-on tone in his headset broke apart into a series of jagged, electronic stutters. The American plane was trying to disappear behind a curtain of noise. "They are jamming us," the radar officer said, his voice tight with frustration. "I have lost the range. The track is flickering." Rezai did not flinch. He reached out and twisted a heavy dial on his right console. He switched the AWG-9 radar into a high-pulse repetition frequency mode. This was the burn-through setting. It concentrated all the radar's energy into a narrow, violent beam. It was designed to punch through the exact kind of noise the Americans were making. "Burn-through active," Rezai muttered. "Find them." The electronic duel moved at the speed of light. The Poseidon shifted frequencies. The Tomcat followed. The P-8 deployed a towed decoy, a small device on a cable that emitted a massive radar signature. It was designed to look like a bigger, more tempting target than the plane itself. "Decoy is away," the Poseidon's tactical officer called out. "He's biting. His radar is locking the decoy." For a heartbeat, the Iranian radar followed the small, bright dot falling behind the American plane. But Rezai was a veteran of 1,000 training hours. He saw the sudden change in the target's velocity. He knew it was a trick. "Ignore the ghost," Rezai commanded. "Filter for velocity. Look for the heavy metal." The Iranian radar officer adjusted his filters. He looked for the Doppler shift of the massive jet engines. He ignored the bright, stationary noise of the chaff. He ignored the false signal of the decoy. Suddenly, the P-8 Poseidon reappeared on his screen. It was a solid, undeniable return. "I have him," the officer said. "Hard lock. Range is 18 miles." The chirping in Commander Jenkins' headset turned into a continuous, terrifying scream. The radar warning receiver was telling her the truth. The jamming had failed. The decoy had been ignored. The Iranian fighter was looking straight down their throat. "He's back on us," the co-pilot yelled. "Commander, the lock is solid. We can't shake him." Jenkins looked at the altimeter. They were at 5,000 feet and falling. The dark water of the Gulf was rushing up to meet them. White caps were visible in the moonlight. She pulled back on the yoke, leveling the heavy plane out just as they hit the thickest part of the coastal haze. "Deploy more chaff," Jenkins ordered. "Keep the jamming at 100%. We need to reach the cover of the carrier strike group's radar." "Range 15 miles, the tactical officer reported. "He is closing at Mach 1.6. He will be in visual range in 60 seconds. The Poseidon was a target in a cage. The electronic shield was being shredded by the raw power of the Iranian radar. In the distance, the twin pillars of fire from the Tomcat's afterburners grew larger and brighter. The duel was over. The hunt had begun. 5:23 in the morning. The dark horizon was beginning to glow with a thin, blood-red line of dawn. The P-8 Poseidon was racing at 300 knots, just 500 feet above the white-capped waves. The salt spray from the Persian Gulf coated the cockpit windows, blurring the vision of the crew. Commander Jenkins could feel the heavy vibration of the low-altitude air, thick and turbulent, slamming against the fuselage of the surveillance plane. "Range 12 miles, the tactical officer reported, his voice tight with controlled panic. "He is directly behind us. We are seeing a weapon guidance uplink. He is ready to fire." Behind them, the Iranian F-14 Tomcat was a silhouette of jagged steel against the fading stars. Captain Rezai felt the vibration of the Mach 1.6 airflow through the floor of his cockpit. The heat in the small space was rising as the electronic systems worked at maximum capacity. He reached out and flipped the red plastic guard off the missile launch button. "Target is centered," the radar officer said over the intercom. The AIM-54 Phoenix has a thermal lock on their right engine and a radar lock on the center mass. Requesting permission to engage, Rezai took a final breath. The air in his mask tasted of rubber and cold oxygen. He looked at the white shape of the American plane. It looked small and fragile against the vastness of the sea. "Weapons free," Rezai commanded. He pressed the launch button. Underneath the belly of the Tomcat, the massive Phoenix missile came to life. There was a mechanical clunk as the heavy shackles released. For a split second, the 500-kilogram missile fell through the air, tumbling into the jet's wake. Then, the solid fuel rocket motor ignited with a deafening roar. A pillar of brilliant white fire erupted from the tail of the missile, bleaching the dark sky. The shock wave of the ignition punched upward, rattling the Tomcat's airframe. The smell of burning chemical propellant, a sharp, acrid bite of ammonium perchlorate, was pulled into the fighter's air intakes. The missile shrieked forward, accelerating from 0 to Mach 4 in seconds. It left a dense, swirling trail of white smoke that hung in the air like a scar. Inside the Poseidon, the cockpit erupted in a new, more violent alarm. The radar warning receiver changed from a steady scream to a rapid, frantic pulsing. "Missile launch! Missile launch!" The co-pilot screamed. "Brake right! Brake right!" Jenkins hauled the control yoke to the right with both hands, throwing her entire weight into the turn. The P-8 groaned. Metal screamed as the wing spars reached their structural limit. In the back, the mission crew were thrown against their harnesses. The cabin lights flickered as the engines strained to provide the hydraulic pressure needed for the violent maneuver. "Deploy everything!" Jenkins yelled. "Flares! Chaff! Give me the jammer on high!" The Poseidon vomited a continuous stream of magnesium flares. They hit the air and ignited, creating a wall of fire behind the plane. The electronic warfare officer jammed the missile's specific frequency, trying to break the invisible thread connecting the Phoenix to its target. But the Phoenix was a different breed of weapon. It was an active radar homing missile. As it closed the distance, it turned on its own internal radar. It didn't need the Tomcat anymore. It was independent. It looked through the smoke. It ignored the flares. It saw the massive radar return of the Boeing airframe and calculated the point of intercept. "The missile is active," the tactical officer cried. "It's not biting on the decoys. It's still on us. Range 6 miles. Time to impact. 8 seconds." Jenkins looked out the side window. Through the salt-smeared glass, she saw it, a tiny, terrifying spark of white light, growing larger by the millisecond. It was moving at 4 times the speed of sound, a spear of fire cutting through the dawn. 5 seconds. "Hold on!" Jenkins shouted, her voice breaking. "Hold on!" The Poseidon was a target in the center of a crosshair that was no longer moving. The distance between the steel and the fire was closing. The hunt was over. The impact was inevitable. 5:24 in the morning. The dark surface of the Persian Gulf was less than 300 feet below the belly of the P-8 Poseidon. The air here was heavy, thick with moisture and the salt of the sea, creating a wall of resistance against the struggling aircraft. Behind them, the AIM-54 Phoenix missile was no longer a distant threat. It was a physical presence, a white-hot spear of vengeance screaming through the atmosphere at nearly 3,000 miles per hour. The missile's internal radar had entered its terminal homing phase. It ignored the final, desperate clouds of chaff and the flickering digital noise from the American jamming pods. It was slave to the massive radar return of the Boeing airframe. The guidance computer made a final, microsecond adjustment to the 4 large fins at the missile's midsection. The servos whined with mechanical stress as the Phoenix pulled 20 G-forces, banking hard to intercept the Poseidon's last-ditch turn. Impact in 3, 2, 1. The tactical officer's voice cut through the cabin. A final, jagged transmission. The missile did not strike the skin of the aircraft. It was designed with a proximity fuse, a laser-guided sensor that detected when the target was within the optimal kill distance. 10 feet from the rear starboard fuselage, the 600-pound high-explosive warhead detonated. The world inside the Poseidon turned white. The blast wave hit the aircraft with the force of a tectonic shift. It was not a sound, but a physical weight that compressed the chests of every sailor on board. The heat blast, reaching temperatures of 3,000 degrees, washed across the tail section, instantly vaporizing the paint and melting the thin aluminum skin. The pressure wave punched inward, shattering the rear pressure bulkhead and sending a lethal spray of shrapnel, thousands of jagged steel cubes through the mission crew's compartment. "We're hit! We're hit!" the co-pilot screamed, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of the atmosphere rushing into the cabin. The explosion severed the primary hydraulic lines and the fly-by-wire control cables that ran to the tail. The horizontal stabilizers, the parts of the plane that kept the nose level, were shredded into useless ribbons of metal. The starboard engine, sucking in the debris of the explosion, sputtered and died in a violent surge of flame. A massive fireball erupted from the wing root, fueled by the thousands of gallons of high-octane jet fuel stored in the tanks. Commander Jenkins felt the control yoke go limp in her hands. The nose of the heavy aircraft pitched down violently, the flight computers screaming in a doomed attempt to compensate for a tail that was no longer there. The smell was the worst part. The acrid chemical bite of burning insulation, the metallic tang of vaporized steel, and the sickening scent of hydraulic fluid hitting hot engine components. Inside the cockpit, the wind was a hurricane. The decompression had blown the door off its hinges, and the air was filled with flying manuals, headsets, and the debris of a shattered mission. Jenkins looked at her instruments, but the screens were flickering and dying, one by one. The horizon was a tilted, spinning line of orange light and black water. "Eject! Eject!" someone was shouting, but the Poseidon had no ejection seats. It was a maritime patrol craft, a converted airliner. There was only the side door, and at this speed and altitude, the door was a gateway to a wall of water moving like concrete. The aircraft was now a burning torch, a 500,000-pound mass of steel and fire falling toward the sea. The starboard wing was a sheet of flame that stretched 50 feet into the air behind them. The fuselage was twisting, the metal groaning and popping, as the structural frame failed under the aerodynamic load. 2 miles away, Captain Rezai watched the impact from his F-14 Tomcat. Through his canopy, he saw the night sky split open. A brilliant, blossoming flower of orange and white light marked the spot where the Phoenix had found its mark. The American plane did not disappear. It broke apart in slow motion. Large pieces of the tail and the wing separated, falling toward the ocean like burning meteors. "Target destroyed," his radar officer said. The voice was flat, devoid of emotion, a contrast to the violence unfolding on the horizon. Rezai banked his fighter. the twin engines roaring as he pulled away from the kill zone. He could see the trail of black smoke, reaching all the way from the sky to the water. The sea below was beginning to churn as the first pieces of the Poseidon hit the surface, creating massive geysers of white spray that stood out against the dark waves. The silence that followed the explosion was absolute. Inside the Tomcat, broken only by the steady, rhythmic breathing of the pilot through his mask. Behind him, the Persian Gulf remained indifferent, a vast and cold witness to the metal and lives now sinking into its depths. 5:25 in the morning. The P-8 Poseidon was no longer an aircraft. It was a collection of failing systems and shattered metal plummeting toward the Persian Gulf. The impact of the Phoenix missile had torn through the rear third of the fuselage, severing the vertical stabilizer and leaving the plane with no means of lateral control. The heavy Boeing airframe was caught in a high-speed graveyard spiral, the nose pointed 30 degrees below the horizon, and the entire structure rotating violently to the right. Inside the cockpit, the centrifugal force pinned Commander Sarah Jenkins against the side of her seat. The world was a blur of spinning dark water, and the strobe light flashes of the burning starboard wing. Every warning light on the instrument panel was illuminated a chaotic tapestry of red and amber that reflected off the shattered glass of the flight displays. The roar of the wind through the ruptured hull was a deafening, physical scream that made communication impossible. "I can't hold her," Jenkins yelled, though she knew her co-pilot couldn't hear her. She fought the control yoke, but it moved without resistance. The hydraulic lines had been bled dry within seconds of the explosion. The smell of burning rubber and the iron-like scent of blood filled the cockpit, as the G-forces pulled at the very fabric of the crew's bodies. In the mission cabin, the scene was one of absolute carnage. The tactical workstations had been ripped from their floor mounts by the initial blast. The surviving crew members were struggling to reach the emergency survival rafts, but the rotation of the aircraft threw them against the bulkheads like ragdolls. The Poseidon hit the water at 340 knots. The ocean did not act like a liquid. At that speed, the surface of the Persian Gulf had the density of reinforced concrete. The nose of the aircraft punched into the swell first, and the kinetic energy of the impact instantly vaporized the forward section of the plane. The cockpit was crushed like a soda can, the steel and glass folding inward on the crew in a fraction of a millisecond. A massive plume of white spray and black jet fuel erupted 200 feet into the air. The remaining fuselage, already weakened by the missile strike, snapped into 3 distinct sections. The heavy engines, still spinning at high RPMs, tore themselves away from the wings and skipped across the water, like stones before sinking. The central wing box, containing the bulk of the fuel, detonated upon impact, creating a secondary fireball that bleached the pre-dawn sky a hellish orange. 4 miles away, Captain Rezai stabilized his F-14 Tomcat and looked over his shoulder. The explosion on the surface was so bright it reflected off the underside of his variable sweep wings. Through the haze of his canopy, he saw the burning debris field spreading across the dark water. Large sections of the fuselage, still engulfed in flames, floated for a few heartbeats, before the weight of the water pulled them under. "Direct hit. Total hull loss," his radar officer reported, his voice cracking slightly. "With the adrenaline of the kill. I have no parachutes. I repeat, no parachutes observed." Rezai did not respond. He felt the cold sweat cooling against his skin inside his flight suit. The mission was a success, but the tactical reality was beginning to settle in. He had just destroyed a United States Navy sovereign platform. He had killed American sailors. The quiet of the cockpit felt heavy, a stark contrast to the violent disintegration he had just witnessed. The debris field was a jagged scar on the surface of the sea. Burning fuel slicked the waves, casting a flickering light on the scattered life vests, mission documents, and fragments of white-painted aluminum that bobbed in the wake of the disaster. The sound of the engines was gone, replaced only by the hiss of fire hitting cold water and the distant, fading roar of the retreating Iranian jet. "Come about to heading 090, Rezai commanded. "We need to get clear of this sector before the Americans arrive." And they will arrive. The Tomcat banked away, its afterburners flickering one last time before fading into the gray light of the coming morning. Below, the last large piece of the Poseidon's tail section, the part that carried the American flag, tilted upward, as if gasping for air, before sliding silently beneath the surface. The Persian Gulf was flat and black once again, hiding the wreckage of $60 million of technology and the lives of 9 crew members. 5:35 in the morning, the Combined Air Operations Center at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. The room was a cavernous, windowless hall filled with the low hum of 500 servers and the frantic clicking of keyboards. Huge, wall-sized digital maps displayed the real-time position of every friendly and unidentified aircraft in the Middle East. At the center of the room, the tactical director stood frozen, his eyes locked on a single data point that had just turned from a steady green to a blinking red X. Lost track on Combat Apple 01. A radar controller called out, his voice cutting through the ambient noise like a blade. Signal is gone. No transponder. No emergency squawk. I have a primary return that just shattered into a dozen pieces. The air in the command center seemed to vanish. Every officer and analyst turned toward the main screen. Combat Apple 01 was the call sign for the P-8 Poseidon. It was not just an aircraft, it was a high-value strategic asset. Check the data link, the tactical director barked. Did the E-3 Sentry pick up the intercept? Sir, the Hawkeye over the Gulf reports a fast mover was closing on the P-8 6 o'clock. A lieutenant replied, her hands shaking as she pulled up the recording. The signature matches an Iranian F-14. We have a definitive launch signature. 1 long-range missile away. 3 seconds later, the P-8 signature disappeared from the network. The silence that followed lasted exactly 5 seconds. It was the sound of a geopolitical tectonic plate shifting. The rules of engagement had been shredded. This was no longer a shadow war of words and maritime harassment. This was an act of open conflict. Get the Admiral on the line, the director commanded, and get the ready 5 fighters from the USS Abraham Lincoln in the air. I want eyes on that debris field in 15 minutes. If that Tomcat is still in the air, I want it locked up. 700 miles away, at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., the sun had not yet set on the previous day. The secure phones in the National Military Command Center began to ring simultaneously. Officers in dress blues and camouflage moved with a sudden, violent purpose. The hotline to Tehran remained silent, but the digital cables connecting the United States Navy's 7th Fleet were pulsing with high-priority traffic. Inside the Situation Room, the initial reports were being briefed to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. The smell of stale coffee and floor wax was thick in the underground bunker. On the monitors, a satellite image from a KH-11 reconnaissance bird was already being processed. It showed a slick of oil and white fragments spreading across the surface of the Persian Gulf, 30 miles off the Iranian coast. What was the mission? The chairman asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Routine maritime surveillance, sir, an intelligence officer replied. They were in international airspace. The intercept was unprovoked. The Iranian pilot gave no warning before firing a Phoenix missile. Do we have survivors? The impact was at high speed, sir. We are seeing a massive debris field. Search and rescue is being coordinated. But the odds are not good. The chairman looked at the map. He saw the red icons of the Iranian coastal batteries and the blue icons of the American carrier strike group moving toward the center of the Gulf. The gears of a massive industrial-scale military machine were starting to turn. In the silos of North Dakota, in the submarine pens of Georgia, and on the flight decks of the Arabian Sea, the alert levels were climbing. The shock waves of the explosion in the dark morning air were no longer physical. They were political. They were strategic. Across the globe, commanders were reaching for their sidearms and technicians were fueling long-range bombers. The death of a single patrol plane was about to become the catalyst for a much larger fire. The Iranians just threw the first punch, the chairman said, leaning over the table. Make sure they understand they won't be the ones to throw the last one. 5:45 in the morning. The flight deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln was a world of screaming turbines and purple-gray shadows. The salt spray from the Arabian Sea whipped across the deck, mixing with the sharp, toxic smell of JP-5 jet fuel. In the pre-dawn gloom, the yellow-shirted flight deck handlers moved with practiced, violent urgency. 2 F-35C Lightning. Two fighters were already hooked into the catapults, their engines glowing with a pale, blue-white intensity. Catapult 1 is hot. Launch! 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 The tactical frequency crackled. The first fighter lunged forward, the steam from the catapult blanketing the deck for a fraction of a second. It reached 150 miles per hour in less than 300 feet, screaming off the bow and into the dark sky. 5 seconds later, the second fighter followed. These were the Vindicators of Strike Fighter Squadron 115. Their mission was simple: find the Iranian Tomcat and ensure it never reached its base at Bandar Abbas. Inside the lead F-35, Lieutenant Commander Viper Vance felt the heavy squeeze of the G-suit against his legs as he climbed toward 30,000 feet. His cockpit was silent compared to the old-school fighters. There were no dials, only a panoramic touch display, and a helmet-mounted system that allowed him to see through the floor of his own aircraft. Vindicator 1. This is Hawkeye. A voice came from the E-2D Hawkeye orbiting 100 miles away. Target is heading 095. Speed Mach 1.4. He is trying to make a run for the coast. You have a 1,000-knot closure rate. Copy, Hawkeye, Vance replied. Switching to active search. Weapon systems are hot. The F-35 was a stealth platform, a ghost in the machine. While the Iranian F-14 relied on its massive, powerful radar to find targets, the Lightning II used passive infrared sensors and low-probability-of-intercept radar. Vance could see the Iranian jet's heat signature from 50 miles away, a bright, pulsing ember on his display caused by the Tomcat's twin afterburners. The Iranian pilot, Captain Rezai, likely had no idea he was being hunted. "I have a track," Vance said, his voice calm. "He's pushed it to Mach 1.6. He's burning fuel like it's free. He knows we're coming, but he doesn't know where we are." Engagement authorized, the Hawkeye controller responded. "The rules of engagement are weapons free on the hostile platform. Do not let him cross the 12-mile limit." Vance adjusted the internal weapon bay doors. Inside the belly of the stealth jet, two AIM-120D AIM-RAM missiles sat ready. These were the most advanced air-to-air missiles in the American inventory, capable of hitting a target from over 100 miles away with pinpoint accuracy. "Master Oman," Vance whispered. He looked at the digital representation of the 14 on his visor. "You should have stayed on the ground this morning." The distance was closing. 40 miles. 35. The F-35 was invisible to the 14's radar, which was currently searching for the heavy, non-stealthy signatures of F-A-18 Hornets. Rezai was looking for a broadsword, but he was about to be hit by a scalpel. "Target is maneuvering," Vance noted. "He's dropping altitude. He's trying to hide in the coastal clutter." It won't work. The air outside the cockpit was freezing, but the heat from the F-35's avionics kept the cabin warm. The smell of recycled air and the faint scent of Vance's own sweat filled his mask. He placed his finger on the side stick controller. He wasn't waiting for a lock-on tone. The computer was already feeding the firing solution directly into the missile's brain. Vindicator 1, Fox 3. A dull thud vibrated through the airframe as the internal bay doors flicked open and shut in less than a second. The AMRAAM dropped into the slipstream before its motor ignited, a white streak of fire that vanished into the distance almost instantly. Vance didn't wait to see the result. He immediately banked his jet, staying outside the Tomcat's radar cone, maintaining the stealthy V of his approach. The hunt was no longer a chase. It was an execution. 5:55 in the morning. The location was coordinates 26 degrees 40 minutes north, 54 degrees 12 minutes east. The sun had finally cleared the horizon, casting a harsh, flat light across the Persian Gulf. The water, which had seemed like a sheet of black glass an hour ago, was now a choppy expanse of slate gray. In the center of the search area, a massive, iridescent slick of jet fuel spread across the waves, smoothing out the whitecaps in a sickening, rainbow-colored circle of chemical waste. An MH-60 Sierra helicopter, callsign C-Knight-71, hovered 50 feet above the debris. The downwash from its main rotor blades whipped the water into a frantic, circular spray. The air inside the cabin was thick with the smell of salt, burnt aviation kerosene, and the metallic tang of the aircraft's own exhaust. Two search and rescue swimmers sat on the edge of the open door, their fins dangling over the abyss, their eyes scanning the wreckage for any sign of life. "I see a life raft," the crew chief shouted over the intercom, his voice competing with the rhythmic thrum of the turbine engines. 2 o'clock, 50 yards. The helicopter banked sharply, the pilot fighting the turbulent air near the surface. Below them, a small, bright orange pod bobbed in the center of the oil slick. It was an automated emergency raft, designed to inflate upon impact. As the Sea Knight moved closer, the crew's hearts sank. The raft was empty. Its canopy had been shredded by falling debris, and it sat low in the water, half submerged and riddled with shrapnel holes. "No survivors in the raft," the rescue swimmer reported, his voice heavy. "I see flight manuals, a helmet, and a lot of white aluminum. Commander, the debris field is too small." The plane didn't just crash. It disintegrated. Scattered across the surface were the remnants of the P-8 Poseidon, a section of the interior cabin wall, still bearing a no smoking sign, floated near a shattered mission workstation. A single flight boot drifted past a piece of the wing's leading edge. There was no sound here except for the wind and the mechanical roar of the helicopter. The silence of the dead was absolute. "Flight, we have a contact on radar," the co-pilot of the Sea Knight interrupted. "Fast-moving surface craft approaching from the north-northeast. Bearing 020. Distance 5 miles. They are Iranian Revolutionary Guard fast attack boats." The rescue mission was suddenly a standoff. Through high-powered binoculars, the crew chief saw the white wakes of 3 Swedish-built Bagamar patrol boats. They were cutting through the swells at 40 knots, their deck-mounted 12.7mm machine guns uncovered and manned. They weren't coming to help. They were coming to claim the wreckage and the secrets of the Poseidon surveillance equipment. "This is Sea Knight 7-1 to incoming surface craft," the pilot broadcasted on the international distress frequency. "We are conducting a search and rescue operation in international waters. Do not interfere with our flight path." The Iranian boats did not slow down. They spread out into a pincer formation, flanking the American helicopter. The tension in the Sea Knight's cabin became a physical weight. The crew chief gripped the handle of the side-mounted M240 machine gun, his thumb resting near the safety. He could see the faces of the Iranian sailors now, their eyes shielded by dark glasses, their weapons pointed toward the sky. "They're trying to push us off the site," the pilot said, his voice straining with the effort of holding the hover. "This is 7-1. We have hostile surface craft on site." "We are being harassed." High above, the sky was silent. But the Iranian sailors on the boats suddenly looked up. A low-frequency rumble, a sound that felt like it was vibrating in their very bones, began to roll across the water. It was the sound of a superpower arriving. 2 F-18 Gulf Growlers, the electronic warfare variant of the Hornet, screamed across the debris field at 500 feet, their engines creating a sonic boom that sent a wall of spray over the Iranian boats. The fast attack boats veered away, their hulls slamming into the waves as they broke formation. For now, the rescue mission would continue. But as the swimmers finally dropped into the oil-slicked water to recover the first of the remains, the reality of the morning became clear. There were no survivors to save. There was only the grim task of gathering the evidence of a war that had already begun. 6:15 in the morning. The Iranian coast was a jagged line of ochre and dust on the horizon. Captain Abbas Rezai pushed his F-14 Tomcat to its structural limits, the airframe vibrating with a violent, rhythmic shudder. He was less than 30 miles from the sanctuary of the surface-to-air missile umbrellas at Bandar Abbas, but the cockpit was filled with the one sound every pilot fears: the steady, low-frequency pulse of a radar warning receiver that had just detected a launch. "Missile in the air! 6 o'clock! No radar source!" his radar officer screamed. Rezai's heart hammered against his ribs. If there was no radar source, it was a stealth launch, an AIM-120D AMRAAM fired from an F-35. He didn't have seconds, he had heartbeats. He slammed the throttles into full afterburner and pulled the stick back into his stomach, attempting a high G barrel roll to break the missile's kinetic track. The twin engines roared, vomiting 20-foot tongues of orange flame into the morning sky. But the AMRAAM was a weapon of surgical precision. It didn't need a constant radar lock from the carrier. It used its own internal, low-probability-of-intercept seeker. It ignored the Tomcat's desperate release of chaff. It adjusted its course with a cold, mathematical certainty. The missile struck the Tomcat's left engine nozzle. The explosion was a concentrated burst of high-velocity shrapnel that shredded the titanium compressor blades and severed the main fuel line. A massive fireball erupted from the rear of the jet, instantly melting the left vertical stabilizer. The 14 yawed violently to the left, the nose pitching up until the wings stalled. "Eject! Eject! Eject!" Rezai yelled, his hand reaching for the face curtain handle. The canopy shattered into 1,000 shards of plexiglass. 2 rocket-propelled seats punched out of the burning wreckage, throwing the pilot and his officer into the freezing, thin air at 20,000 feet. Below them, the pride of the Iranian Air Force became a tumbling pyre of scrap metal, falling in a long, smoking arc toward the coastal shallows. As the parachutes blossomed over the water, the sky above them remained empty. The F-35C that had fired the shot was already turning back toward the Abraham Lincoln, its presence never recorded by any Iranian sensor. The electronic silence that followed was more deafening than the explosion. By 7 in the morning, the tactical phase of the engagement was over. The P-8 Poseidon was at the bottom of the Gulf. The F-14 Tomcat was a scorched smudge on a coastal reef. But the silence that descended over the region was not the silence of peace. It was the heavy, breathless pause of a world waiting for the next move. In the Pentagon, the lights remained on. In Tehran, the Supreme National Security Council was in an emergency session. The loss of 9 American sailors and 2 Iranian aircrew was no longer a local tragedy. It was a catalyst. The Strait of Hormuz remained open, but the insurance rates for every tanker in the water had tripled in the last hour. The global economy, like the crews on the warships, was bracing for the impact. The Persian Gulf returned to its natural state, a vast, gray expanse of water under a rising sun. The oil slicks from the 2 lost aircraft eventually drifted apart, thinned by the currents and the wind. By noon, the only physical evidence of the morning's violence was a few charred fragments of white and gray aluminum bobbing in the tide. This was the new reality. There would be no formal declaration. There would be no clear winner. Only the dead silence between reloads, and the knowledge that the next time the radar chirped, it wouldn't be a warning. It would be an epitaph.